Reference to Gail.
Yeah.
Marla will be organizing some meals, so just contact Marla.
Yeah, yes. So reach out to Marla. She is coordinating meals. She is back here, for Gail for that time, and thank you for that. Okay, let's go to God in prayer.
Exodus chapter 20. This is where we get a telling of the Ten Commandments. So Exodus chapter 20, starting in verse 3, it says, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in earth below, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I am the Lord your God. I am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. So I want to start by looking at Exodus chapter 20, because I think it brings the proper emphasis and the proper importance to this subject of idolatry. When we're looking at the Ten Commandments, I mean, the first two relate to the subject, or address the subject specifically. So it demonstrates to us that God is really trying to make a point here. That one, idolatry is an important subject to him, it's a big deal to him. And in the same way that if he's bringing it up first and so soon, and in such an important place, that he must have known it would be a problem for us. Maybe we don't think about that all the time. Sometimes we separate, or sometimes people mentally move idolatry to being more of an Old Testament issue as opposed to a New Testament issue. It's not the case. We see it in both places. And so with that being said, I think one of the main reasons we see it being one of the first commandments, or the first and second commandment, is because God knew it would be a problem for us. As much as it was a problem to the people he was first speaking to, the Israelites. So, with that being said, I think it sums up and puts out generally what idolatry is. From this verse, what can you tell about idolatry? In terms of giving somebody a definition. Somebody walked up to you and said, what is idolatry? Based off of this verse, what would you tell them? Go ahead, Alan.
Putting something else as a god.
Yeah.
Because the first line says, you shall have no other gods before me. And if it relates to idols, then those idols are referred to as gods, or don't have any other gods besides me.
Yeah, it's like there's a seat, there's this throne, there's this number one position that is supposed to belong to God. And so based off of verse 3, what we can see is idolatry in some sense, or at least breaking that commandment, is taking someone else and putting them in that first seat, putting God in the second seat. So putting anything before God, that's perfect.
Go ahead, Ms. Denise.
I have a question.
Sure.
In our society, most people look at wealth as major importance, education, wealth, power. Is that an idol when it takes over the place of God?
Absolutely.
Now, it's not an image standing up. You haven't carved something, but it does replace God.
Yes, exactly. No, I would definitely say that even if it's not specifically an image carving, I think it still applies to verse 3 in the sense of you're taking something and you're putting it before God. And you're making it into some type of God and putting it before God. So I would think, or I would say that definitely apply. Mr. Marlowe?
I have a question too. I grew up kneeling before a giant crucifix with the statue of Jesus hanging on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always been a little confused about that because I know now that a graven image is something God doesn't want, even if it's trying to make a graven image of God, because of course you can't encapsulate God in a statue. But we didn't actually pray at that statue like it was God, but just, that's wrong too, correct?
Yes. I mean, in a sense, if it falls into that area, yes. I mean, what you're saying applies to verse 4 specifically. It's this concept of God saying, don't try to take me and create me into some form of physical likeness. I think part of that is just due to the fact that we probably, no matter how you do it, you're probably not going to do it correctly. God is so complex, is so multifaceted that any way that we try to make some physical specific likeness as to who he is going to be off or wrong somehow. And a lot of times, or for sure, we're going to find some way to misrepresent him or mischaracter him, which creates all these problems. So in terms of like the situation you're talking about specifically of like bowing down to the cross, I think you just, I don't know. You have to be very careful about it, because I think the cross does properly and truly does represent Christ and the sacrifice that he made, and it stands for a lot of things that we trust in, that we believe in as Christians. But I think you just have to be careful if we do it, or when we're doing something to make that cross into God himself. I don't think anybody thinks that, but you have to be careful, right? We talked about the meaning of the word worship being to literally bow down. And so maybe not bowing down, but maybe the route to go in, the way to go in that situation is to just not bow down to the cross specifically, but still bow down in prayer, find some other more direct way, or one that's not so iffy to demonstrate that dedication to God, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question, Ms. Marlowe?
Partly.
Yeah.
I still wonder if a cross is considered a graven image.
I wouldn't consider a cross to be a graven image. Go ahead, Rob.
Would you consider it a likeness of anything that's in earth, above earth, under the earth, or in the water?
Are you asking me?
Yeah. You asked the question.
It seems to me like it's a likeness of something on earth that represents, in the minds of American Christians today, Jesus, the crucifixion.
Right.
And it's not in trying to make an image of God or a God, but it represents something about God.
Right.
So it's not,
Good now.
And that's the challenge, because we have to realize that every religious group is striving to do, hopefully, the right thing, right? As they might put that on there, or as many homes have either a picture of Jesus or a crucifix or something along those lines to remind you, right, to do something good. I mean, do we not have, maybe in our own house, like a verse of the Bible on there? And we look at that and it reminds us, hey, we've got to do something good, right? There's something that we look to as a reminder and something to put it into practice. And so I don't want to sit here in this pew and be able to say that everybody's doing it to be able to put a God before them. However, there's an aspect where, just as you mentioned, there is that, how close do you want to walk that line, right, before stepping off the edge where we have created something, or we're taking a likeness and we're looking at it as something, well, we need this. I mean, even with that pole that Moses erected when the serpent was on it, years and years and years later, they found it. They began worshiping it.
Right.
They began worshiping it because they thought that had the power. Jesus, or God here, is saying, the problem is, no matter what you make, no matter what you do, you're now worshiping the created rather than the creator.
Right.
And the whole idea here is that there is nothing in this earth that's able to truly, like you said, encapsulate the love and the devotion as just going directly to God.
Right.
But yet we all have those reminders. I mean, we have reminders every Lord's Day.
Mm-hmm.
You know, why do we have reminders? They are to remind us, you know, but these are symbols that we have to be careful not to idolize the bread and the fruit of the vine. Right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So it's being cautious.
Right. I'm getting a lot of hands. Oh, I'll take this.
Well, getting back at like the bowing down, like I have been on my hands and knees and I have prayed to God.
Right.
But I have never bowed down to something to pray to God.
Right.
And that's where I think what I would consider crossing the line.
Right.
Because you're bowing down to something to talk to God, and you don't need that. But you put it there, and you bow down to it, and I believe that's being insensitive to Him.
Yeah, I think it's.
Like you're adding that to your worshiping the Lord.
Right.
You don't need that.
So,
Because we have Him.
exactly. So we have biblical examples of people taking things and letting them be reminders to them of God, things that God did, for them, events where this thing occurred, right? We have an example of Jacob laying his head and resting it on a rock, and he sees a vision of angels ascending and descending on a ladder, and God speaks to him in that moment, and he takes that rock and he makes an altar from it. That exact thing, he anoints the rock. And so he lets it be a reminder to him, but it'd be a different thing if he started bowing down to the rock in some sense. And so I think scripturally we have an example that it's okay to, in some sense, have a reminder. I think the New Testament pushes it even farther in terms of saying we don't even need anything physical as a, to help us worship or to help us have a reminder. We have the Word, and everything else has been pretty much made spiritual. But again, yes, once we start to take these physical things and if we anyway start to say that they're God or make them into God, that's where the real issue becomes. Yes, Denise?
Well, when I heard Marla ask the question, what came to my mind is I was also raised Catholic, and one of the first things that came up after I was converted was all the crosses that we had.
Mm-hmm.
In our house, in our Bibles, in our whatever. We had the rosaries and blah, blah, blah. And the thing that really kind of it boiled down to was, in my mind, it's a stumbling block to some people to have them there, because as being raised a Catholic, they were considered powerful. They weren't, you didn't pray to the cross, but having one somehow carried a force that isn't there. And so if I left it in my environment and I participated by having them, I felt like I could be teaching somebody else that they had that power. Just because I know there's an element in our society that does believe that. And I had to let go of that, and I just felt like it was, in my mind, something I couldn't do anymore, have it around.
Right. I think that may speak a lot to why God said what he said, right? Not to make any type of likeness of what he is physically. I think a large part of it is, part of being a Christian, being considerate. We recently talked about outreach and adhering to or thinking about how we would communicate to the world. I think one thing we have to be conscious of is what the things that we do and the actions we take, what that means or what that says to someone else. I remember when I was at FC, we were trying to find a symbol for this club that we have that just does devotionals regularly through the week called Source Club. And we thought, what if we make the symbol a cross, right? And someone else has said, well, that's become kind of Baptist, wouldn't you say? And we're like, or it could just be the symbol of Christ's resurrection, what we pull from Scripture. But it is, we do have to think or be conscious of that. It's like, okay, now this symbol has come to mean this other thing. But at the end of the day, yes, you don't need that to communicate God, to tell somebody who God is, to represent God. And so I think this is all good conversation in terms of idols and likenesses and what idolatry is. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Okay, so my brain with this was going, okay, hang on, this is the Old Testament. You can't bind the Old Testament. I'm not trying to sound like a heretic, but we can't bind the Old Testament. So I started doing some digging.
Okay.
I'm curious, where is this reiterated in the New Testament? Well, the whole idea is all over the place in the New Testament. But for anybody else that was curious like me, that wants a specific, like, where is this reiterated? In Galatians 5:19 through 21, right before it gives the work, or the fruit of the Spirit, it's giving the works of the flesh. And right there in, hang on, verse 20, idolatry. So, like, I'm just one of those where I see stuff in the Old Testament and I know that we're bound under the new law now. So I get curious on things like that. Where are things reiterated in the New Testament to make sure I'm not trying to bind something that is an old law?
Right.
So, I'm not trying to sound like a heretic, but I did find it, if anybody else was curious, it's Galatians 5:19 through 21.
Yeah, it's not, we'll actually get to that in a minute. It's not the only place that we see, again, in the New Testament, the concept of idolatry coming up. To wrap up kind of what we've kind of discussed so far, again, God, if we're asking what idolatry is, right, it's essentially taking something, putting it before God. It can be, taking something, putting it before God, taking some kind of physical likeness or physical thing, and and making that into God or attributing that to be God, trying to give God some kind of physical form or something like that. Essentially, we don't need any physical thing to worship God. We don't need something physical to know our God and have to be conscious of what we're doing and what we're putting out there, the messages and symbols that we're using as Christians, and making sure we're not misrepresenting God or giving the wrong message to somebody else. But essentially, what is idolatry? It's giving the worth or the honor, the praise that's supposed to be given to God to something else that it doesn't belong to. It's bowing down to something else that isn't God, elevating something over us in a way that we should be elevating God, to taking something else and elevating it in that way, putting anything before God, making something else into God. Again, it's all right for us to have reminders and things like that, but I think it can be pretty clear in the Christian mind when it starts to fall into something like this. And in the same way, again, we can have these reminders. We can have things that help us remember the things that God has done for us, remember characteristics, the attributes of God. But when they start to also communicate these things to other people, that's when it becomes an issue. Does that make sense to everyone? Cool. Rebecca?
We need to be encouraged by looking back at the faithful through biblical times, because this was a super prevalent issue that they faced in biblical times. From the Egyptians to the Romans to the Babylonians, I mean, you think about the cultures that they were faced with. They were very polytheistic societies. So it's like, it's not something that was foreign to them. And if they could deal with it, faced every day with very polytheistic societies going, this God is real and this God is real, we can do it, no matter how hard it is. To, pick whatever is your tripping idol. We've got this. We can do it.
Mm-hmm.
It just might be hard, but they did it.
Yeah.
We can do it.
Yeah. So thank you for pointing that out, because, again, I think not only do our minds maybe struggle with the concept of idolatry in terms of understanding the ins and outs of it, but I think the outside world even more, in the sense of if they sat down and read a Bible, they're probably like, okay, I'm not carving some image to some God in my household. How does this even apply? When the New Testament would suggest that idolatry would still be just as rampant in our society as it would be in Roman society. So that leads me to the next question I want to ask, which is, what is specifically, or what can be in our time, an idol? So the first place I want to look is Colossians chapter 3, verse 5. It would reflect, it would echo, it would be just like the text from Galatians chapter 5. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5, it says, "Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you: sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, covetousness, which is idolatry." And so this relates to the Galatian passage in the sense that the writer, Paul here, is listing off these sins, and grouped among these sins, he says idolatry, or more specifically in Colossians, says that these things are idolatry. And so the reason I wanted to look at this passage in terms of trying to define, or trying to point to what an idol can be, especially in our society, one, is where we see it in the New Testament, but two, it's looking at these acts, these passions, these temptations that we see the modern Christian would struggle with, that the past Christian would struggle with. I don't know if we automatically think this way, but I think it points us in the right direction in terms of understanding what in me and your daily life could be an idol. Again, we're not taking wood and like carving some type of calf, carving a fish, carving the image of some man and saying, this is God. But what Paul tells us is doing the same thing, is not putting these things to death, but continuing to practice things like sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire. Saying when you are doing these things, you are being idolatrous. Go ahead, Kayla.
What I have noticed with my generation and younger specifically is this need for a cause, like even fellow Christians, where it's like, let's rally behind, pro-life, or they need a cause to rally behind, and I always just sit there and I go, but isn't our cause the gospel?
Right.
Like, we already have our calling and our cause and what we should be promoting, and everything that you should be pouring all of your energy into is the spreading of the gospel. So why do we get so distracted with these good causes? But it's like, I don't need to fill my time doing that if it's, especially if it's gonna take away from the sharing of the gospel.
Yes.
It's like, it's all over social media of like, you need to be a part of this and a part of this, and you need to rally for this cause. And when I see other Christians getting sucked into that, and I'm going, but you don't put that much outpouring and that much effort in sharing the gospel on social media.
Right.
And that is, I think it is an idol. You're trying to do something good, and it takes up so much of your time that you've dethroned the main focus that should be in your life.
Exactly. Right. So I think what speaks to that specifically is 1 John chapter 5, verses 20 through 21. John's writing here, and he says, "And we know that the Son of Man has come, has given us understanding, so that we may know him who is true, and we are in him who is true, and in his Son, Jesus Christ. He is the true God and eternal life. Little children, keep yourselves from idols." So he's talking about Christ. He's talking about the gospel. He's talking about the understanding we get from those things. And he ends it all with saying, little children, keep from idols. Keep yourselves from idols. And when I first read this, it fell out of place. John says this, and then the book ends. Not only does the entire chapter end, the book ends. This is the last note that John leaves 1 John on. And so I was seeing it in that same type of way is, okay, you can take a person and you can make them into your Christ. You can say this person is my Savior, or make them into your Savior somehow. You can take the gospel, you can take something else and make it into the gospel. And I think the best way that helps me to understand that is the gospel isn't just the story of Jesus. The gospel isn't just the thing that saved my life for the life to come after this physical one. Our salvation in the gospel is something that's supposed to entirely change and affect our lifestyle, our behavior, our attitude and mindset. Christianity is literally a worldview. Once you become a Christian, the way that you view the world, the way that you see the world should be different. Once I know that I am saved, I'm rescued, I'm in the arms of God, it should change the way that I live. It should keep me or allow me to keep on keeping on no matter what. So when other people are finding other things to be the reason for that, other things to be a Christian for, as opposed to that alone, yeah, we start to fall in this place of idolatry in terms of what Christ died for, we're letting something else be that motivation. Who Christ is, we're letting someone else or something else be that exact thing. Do you have a comment, Rob? Or I thought I saw your hand. Go ahead, Alex.
To your original question, what does an idol in today's world? I can make this three simple points.
Mm-hmm.
Sport teams, athletes, musicians, politicians.
Yeah.
I myself used to be that way especially, but I've changed a lot since then. But I can see it now in the world today of how they put that before church.
Yeah.
Oh, hey, guess what? I'm going to a Packer game right before church. Sorry, God, I'm putting the Packers first before you at that.
Right. So in the category of what is an idol, what can be an idol, it's very huge. It's very broad. And simply put, it can be anything or it can be anyone. It's just once you take those things and you start putting them before God or making them to serve the purpose of who God is, that's when it becomes an idol. Go ahead, Rebecca.
My brain just goes to, you can make an idol anything that displaces God in your life. Something as simple as, okay, this might make me sound like a 90-year-old woman. I cross-stitch. Like, I cross-stitch while I watch Downton Abbey or whatever. Wow, I sound like 90. Anyway, I could let that become an idol for me. I could let that become my priority. I could let my daughter become my idol if I'm not careful. I think it's literally anything that we start putting before God as our main priority. He and I just had a conversation tonight at dinner about, he said something about, I'm the best thing that ever happened to you, and I went, no. And he was like, okay, I'm the best thing that's happened to you in the past 10 years. I'm like, yeah. But like, he's not number one, and I'm not his number one. And if we ever get to that point, then we've got a big problem. Because we should never be the idol for the other. God should always be our number one, even above our spouses, our children, our parents. Pick your thing. You can make it a person, you can make it a hobby, you can make it whatever you want, but it's anything that takes your focus completely, well, even, it's anything that takes your focus from God, that takes your priority off God.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess that can be a little shocking at first to hear, in terms of the things that we prioritize so much in life and things that we think are really important in life. Maybe looking at it from the small picture, it's hard to say, like, God, really, aren't you asking for a lot? In the grand scheme, we take those things, we make them our number one, we won't get far, literally, in the sense of if this life is all that we had or we act like it, that's nothing in the grand scheme of eternity.
Well, and should we focus to, instead of Jack being my idol or River being my idol, I look at God and I can go, thank you for Jack. Thank you for River. God gave them to me. It's not that I am so great that I went and found them. God blessed me with them. Why would I ever put anything above the one that gives me the best?
Well put. Yeah, very well put. I think that's the very specific way that's described in the Old Testament. And idolatry in general is this concept of you're taking what God has created and you are making that into God, right? You're flipping things upside down. It's a slap in the face to God, right? It's supposed to, we're using the things that are supposed to point to God and making them into God. And it's backwards. Alan, you had a comment?
Yeah, the verse before this, First Colossians.
Yes. Colossians 3.
First Colossians as opposed to 3. Colossians, yeah. My point is real quick, is that, I think it's obvious that idols don't have to be animate
Right.
objects. They don't have to be events. They don't have to be people. Right here, these are all inanimate. Immorality, impurity, passion. These
Yes.
are things in the air. Desires, covetousness. It's not an animate object, so it doesn't have to be animate.
Right. So, we've talked about a lot up until this point, so let's try to pull it back together. We know what worship is. It's giving honor and praise to something. It's bowing down to something. Idolatry is in taking something and putting it before God in that same way, right? Giving God's worth to something else, bowing down to that thing in the way that you should be bowing down to God. And what is an idol? It's anything, anyone that we then do those things to. And it doesn't have to be physical. It's also non-physical things. In Colossians 3, we see they're taking these non-physical things, these earthly pursuits and these desires, sexual morality, impurity, passion. By the way, the ESV says passion. That's just another way of saying lust. It's taking those things and putting them before God. It's taking those things and lowering ourselves to them in the way that we should be lowering ourselves to God. So, Alex, did I miss a hand? Go ahead, Mr. Wright.
Actually, a lot of these things that you can really easily identify, there's some that creep up on you. For instance, your job.
Right.
As a man, you can say, it's important for me to care for my family and my children, and that's what God expects of me. Therefore, if they want me to work Sunday, I really need to do it because I have to keep my employer happy, and that's going to make God happy with me. And that can become elevated to the point you're making that more important than God. And that can be a difficult decision at times.
Yes.
There's lots of things in our life that aren't always going to be real black and white and easy to decide. And you got to really step back and evaluate it compared to where you're at with God.
Right. That actually reminds me a little bit of what Kaylee said in terms of movements and people making that their gospel and that priority. Is that sometimes the things that we're looking at, they're not wrong, right? I'm trying to provide for my family. Or think about some of the movements, even today, that are looking for like the rights of people, right? That's not a bad thing. But again, that's like looking at one aspect of the gospel, one aspect of the big picture, and making that into everything. And it's also missing, right, the true cause being sin in people's lives. And so, again, you're taking one small thing, you're taking the lesser and making it into the greater. But I think that's a very great point. It's just, it can be deceiving in terms of your motivation or partial motivation in terms of what you're doing. But, yeah, some of them are hard to recognize and hard to see. Let's see here. Anything, physical, non-physical that we put before God. Okay, how are idols worshipped? I want to ask this question because I think it relates to what you just said, Mr. Mike. in terms of sometimes we can recognize what is an idol in our life in terms of better understanding how we worship idols. And I think this will also better help us to understand how we worship God, maybe in some ways that don't first come to our mind. But I think Alex was touching on it as well. 1 John. Okay. Isaiah chapter 44, starting in verse 12. Essentially what's happening here is the process of making an idol is being described in Scripture. So in verse 12 it says, the iron maker takes a cutting tool and he works it out of coals. He fashions it with hammers and he works it with his strong arm. He becomes hungry and with his strength he fails. He drinks no water and is faint. The carpenter, he stretches a line. He marks it out with a pencil. He shapes it with planes and he marks it with a compass. He shapes it into the figure of a man and with the beauty of a man to dwell in a house. Okay, the reason I brought this up, or that this came to mind in terms of how do we worship idols, it's talking about the concept of making a physical structure. Okay, maybe we're getting lost here in terms of we're not making a physical likeness nowadays normally, right, to identify something as a god, right? So how does this apply to us? What stuck out to me when reading this text is just the amount that this man is pouring into making this idol. And I think once we think of it in that way, it then becomes more apparent to us what's our idols, or what can be an idol in our life when we're pouring that much into something else. Let's see if I've listed it here. Yes, okay. Things that pointed out to me in the text was the amount of time that's being spent trying to make this idol look good, right? The beauty of a man is being put into this idol. The amount of energy just being put here. This man is skipping meals. He's not drinking water. He wants to get this done. The resources that are getting poured into this. We get later on in the text, we're told about the amount of lumber and things like that this man is using to create or make this idol. The thought process, right? It's like how much, it talks about the planes, right? The lines that are stretched, how he's marking out these pencils, he's taking his compass. How long does this edge need to be? How tall does it need to be, right? What's the width that this structure needs to be? There's just so much thought that's going into this idol for this man. Sacrifice is another thing I put in terms of, okay, he's using this wood or the cedar to make this idol. What else could he be using this for? The text actually goes on to say that the same wood that he uses to fuel his fire, right, is the same wood that he's using to make an idol, right? It could have been used for something else or for something better. He's sacrificing using what could be used for himself to make this idol. I put comprehension last as well. The amount of comprehension that is going into this idol. That might sound weird. The reason I say that is because he has this idol figured out. He knows the dimensions of it. He knows everything about it, right? If you asked him about this idol, he could tell you everything about it. Again, this reminds me of John chapter 1, when it talks about the darkness and how the darkness does not comprehend God. Right? He doesn't have them figured out. We talked about how complex and how multifaceted God is. That was where we started the conversation. Unlike this idol, right, God has there's so much to learn about God and there's so much to figure out. This idol, right, there's nothing to figure out. He knows all of it because he made it himself. So if we're pouring ourselves into a situation that we know all the entire ins and outs of, it just again points to the ridiculousness of idolatry, or the ridiculousness of what we're spending more time on or prioritizing or putting before God. But anyway, when we see ourselves putting all these things into something, where we're making all these sacrifices, putting all this thought, all this resource, all this money, this time and energy into something, and then we look at God and realize that we're putting all that into, or more of that, to whatever this thing is than to God, then we might need to start asking some questions. Go ahead.
Just what you were saying on that list.
Yes, ma'am.
Once they do all that, then they normally put a value on their idol.
Mm-hmm.
As well.
Yeah.
Like it's worth something, like they put a value.
Right. Again, it's puts it in a box, right, which you can't really do with God. So it points to the ungodliness of what's being done here. Okay, last thing I want to look at, or not last thing, but the next thing in terms of how idols are worshipped. One aspect we can look at it is all the things that we pour into an idol. The next thing we can look at is what we see in Psalm 115. Starting in verse 4, the psalmist writes, "Their idols are silver and gold. They're the works of human hands. They have mouths, but they do not speak. They have eyes, but they do not see. They have ears, but they do not hear. Noses, but they do not smell. They have hands, but they do not feel. And they have feet, but they don't walk anywhere. And they do not make a sound in their throat. Those who make idols, that being the them, become like them. And so do all who trust in them." I saw this psalm is in the Old Testament. Where we see the application of this psalm is in the New Testament, is when Jesus is talking. In Psalm chapter 13, or not Psalm, Matthew chapter 13, verses 13 through 17, Jesus is telling the parable of the sower, and when he's giving an explanation to his disciples, he's talking about how some people are not going to understand. When Jesus says, "He who has ears, let him hear," this is what he's referencing in terms of there are people who have ears, but they're not listening. They're not using their ears to listen to reason, to comprehend important information. We see the same thing in John chapter 9 and verse 39 with the story of the blind man. When Jesus goes back to the blind man, he says, "Christ, I have come to make the blind see and to make some who see blind," which is a weird statement. Jesus came to blind some people? What does that mean? How does that work? Again, I think he's referencing this concept that some people who are devoting themselves, they're devoting their lives to other things, are becoming like the things that they're devoting themselves to, right? Without sight, without hearing, without speaking. And so I say this to say that when we worship idols, we start to become like them, right? We make ourselves, we devalue ourselves, right? By valuing something that isn't God or worshiping something that isn't God. We become like the things that we worship. But in that same sense, one way that we worship idols is the intensity that we look at something and want to be like it. It's one thing for me to look at someone, have them as a role model, have them as a teacher, and say that I like this person, and there's these aspects of this person, and again, that very situation can become dangerous, right? Me wanting to take on their likeness in every single way. I think one way to avoid that and one way to get away from that is to, when we're talking about other people or looking to other people, not looking at the whole person or taking the whole person as good, but looking for Christ in that person specifically. It's one thing for me to role model or have somebody as a role model and say, like, I want to be just like that person. It's another thing for me to say, I see Christ in this person. They're doing this good thing, and I relate that to Christ. Not only does it help me, it can help the person in terms of what I say to them. Even if it's a non-believer, you can say, hey, that's a very Christ-like thing that you did. Or when you're doing this, it's a lot like Christ. And it can speak to them. Anything can help them in this way. But anyway, that's what I was saying, it going in both ways. When we worship something, we become like it. But in the same way, we then have to be careful about who we want to be like or what we want to be like. Okay. So how are idols worshipped? By pouring everything into something, pouring our everything into something. We saw that in Isaiah 44 with how much of all this, essentially all this man has, he's giving or putting into this idol, longing for someone else's likeness, right? We saw that in terms of Psalm 115 and understanding that whatever we worship, we then become like. So we have to be careful about what we want to be like or who we want to be like. It's making something else your life motivation as opposed to, or something else your life motivation that isn't God or isn't the gospel. And what we see also in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5 is taking these actions and these thoughts. It's taking specific actions and thoughts in our daily lives. Again, we get moved away from the concept of idolatry with just the thought of carving out some physical image, and not understanding that idolatry is also practicing in evil desires or having thoughts or actions that fulfill evil desires. And that's what Colossians 3 highlights, right? He says when you are practicing sexual immorality, when you're being impure, when you're lusting, you are worshiping something that is not God. That's what he's trying to get across there. So in that same way, we can take that. We can also take all these things and help us to truly understand how to then worship God instead. Because what these scriptures show us or demonstrate to us is that these are different ways of worshiping, but worshiping the wrong thing. We can take each and every one of these aspects and then point them towards God and make it true worship. Again, there's ways of taking worth, honor, and praise and putting them to the right place as opposed to the wrong place. It's different ways of bowing down and lowering ourselves, but we're just doing it to the wrong place. It's trying to find the right place. So again, we're looking at idolatry not just to understand idolatry, but to better understand worship. So we talked about thoughts and actions, again in Colossians 3, chapter 5. As opposed to acting on and thinking about impure things, sexual immorality, lust, what Colossians overall describes is these earthly things, these earthly desires. We can take heavenly things or godly things and spend time actively acting on those things or thinking about those things. Again, the gospel is something that affects or should touch every aspect of our life. And so in that way, it should change our attitude and changes our behavior. That's essentially what all the New Testament is, but essentially, but more specifically, the epistles. Right? We have the Gospels. Now, what do we do about it? How do we act on it? Right? You have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then Acts. And so you have these people instructing Christians on how they're supposed to behave, how they ought to behave. Again, that is a way that we then go and we worship God. Last time when we were talking about worship, we focused a lot on the corporate aspect and what we've been commanded. And sometimes we can lose how in our daily lives, maybe some of the more things we consider to be casual, how those things in a way also worship God. So I also wanted to underline the fact that it's both intentional also. It's actively trying to do these things. So our thoughts and actions are a way that we can worship God or direct that worth and honor and praise to the right place. Another way is through actively making the gospel our motivation in life. And I was working really hard tonight on trying to verbalize that or help us to better understand that. Because it's really easy to give a box up nice invitation that are good words that people don't understand, right? For example, saying, you need to make the gospel your life. And everybody's like, yeah, but the new Christian in the room is like, okay, but what does that mean? Or how do I do that? And so the way I was thinking about it was just, again, trying to find ways to communicate that the gospel is supposed to be the thing that moves us. There's a lot going on in everybody's life, right? And it's easy for us not to mentally be affected by the things around us and by the world, right? There are ways that we're supposed to just let go of everything that's around us, but it's a lot easier said than done, right? I can say these things, but I then have to act on them. So, for example, as like a young single Christian leaving FC, I can look around and see my peers succeeding in different ways, right? Okay, we just all got out of school. So-and-so is making a whole lot of money in whatever his career is. And it's easy for me to be like, oh, I don't care about that, and see them succeeding in the way that they are. Again, I can say, I'm all good as long as I have God, but it's another thing when I see everybody my age going out and getting married and looking really happy together, right? One thing in terms of making the gospel my life, it changing my behavior, letting it be my motivation, is truly understanding that nothing else matters as long as I have the gospel. If I'm baptized, I'm saved, I'm staying in walk with God, I'm actively working each day on getting closer to Him, I'm good. And that should be a comfort to all of us. Again, if we're worrying about providing for our family and providing and financially supporting, right, our children and things like that's a true worry. But it's another thing for me to actively work to the point of understanding that what gets me through life or pushes me to continue to live, right, is the gospel. It was a couple slides that I passed by, but the reverse of that, what that looks like is, for someone whose motivation isn't the gospel and is something else, it looks like them saying, I can't live without whatever this thing is. Whatever this movement is, I can't live without this movement. Money, I can't live without money. On the contrary, being a Christian and having the gospel as a motivation instead is saying, I can live without these things because I have Christ. Having Christ in my life means truly living or being able to go through anything, right? So when we make these other things our idols, we're fighting to have these things that say that for me to succeed, for me to continue on, for me to be successful in this life, I have to have this thing. And it's me constantly fighting to get it. It's a literal rat race. On the contrary, being a Christian and understanding that Christ's sacrifice is all you need, it's saying that I may get these things, I may not. But I can have comfort, I can have a peace of mind and understanding that I'm going to get through this somehow with God. It may be tough, I may be in the midst of it, it's not just going to remove it from my life, but I have God with me and that means something. Again, I'm just trying to separate that because sometimes I don't feel like that is super clear. Go ahead, Jack.
A couple things. To wrap this up in a way, yeah, don't put anyone before God. You know, idolatry is evil, sinful thing. What's the opposite of that? Are you putting God in that position in your life? Is He at that throne of all importance in your primary goal? That's where we should be going towards. And then in a nice way of explaining it to someone who might be either new to the faith or just a young Christian or something like that, who's just having a hard time to be like, okay, what does that mean in my life? And the first thing that came to my mind was the parable of the Lord that loaned out money, and he had 10 talents, 5 talents, and 1 talent. What was the expectation? Is for them to grow with those talents, with the things that he gave them.
Exactly.
That's God's expectation for us. Is we're given this amazing gift, and our requirement is to take that gift and to grow with it. It's not, I have to make 10 shekels a week. It's what am I doing? Am I growing? Am I learning? Am I increasing in some way? And there's just so many facets into, you can dive deeper into that and so on, but that was what first came to my mind is we're expected to grow. If we're not growing in the faith, we're growing in something else, which means we're putting something else ahead of God.
Right. Exactly. Very well put. Finding different ways to help somebody understand what having the gospel in their life means and a gospel being a motivation for them means. Again, it's very different for me to say my goal is to amass as much wealth as I can. My goal is to look as good as I can. My goal is to be as happy as I can be. It's very different for me to say those things versus saying my goal is to be closer to God and to bring others closer to Him too. Anyway, we've talked about a lot tonight. Hopefully it hasn't been too much of a mess. Again, we talked about what worship is, and we recapped what worship is and what that means, to then understand that idolatry is taking those aspects of worship, the worth that's supposed to be given to God, the submissiveness that we're supposed to show to God, and giving it to something else, someone else, to really anything that isn't God. And so with that being said, we then see that in our lives, to idols, we take our thoughts, we focus our thoughts and actions on these things, and that's a way of worshiping them. We let them be the motivation in our lives. We pour everything that we have into them. We give to them and sacrifice to them. We look at people, we look at things, and we try to become like them. And what we want to then do is take those actions, take those same types of motions, and just put them in the right place. We want to repent, right, which is to turn away. We want to take that same motion and turn it in the right direction, right? Have these actions and these thoughts, but make them godly and make them holy, just things that intentionally bring us closer to God. We want to take the gospel and let it be a motivation for us to get us through this life and farther. We want to take the things that we have, we want to use them for God, right? God has created everything. It's either a tool that gives us closer to Him or farther from Him. And let's actively think about how we can use each one of those things to get closer to Him. And then just looking to be like Christ. Looking at what in our lives we can do to be more like Him, but also looking at other people and seeing what's in them that is like Christ and what we can take on ourselves. So again, I hope that's helped us to better understand worship in terms of looking at idolatry, understanding what idolatry is so we don't fall into it, but then understanding the worship aspects of idolatry to understand the right places to put it towards. I don't think has the second bell rung yet? Go ahead, Ms. Marlon.
We've been, some of us have been concentrating on learning how to see Christ in the Old Testament. I found one tonight.
Okay.
I didn't even look at it. But in Exodus chapter 20,
Okay.
and in verse 6, where God is finishing this talk about idolatry, and he talks about being a jealous God, and that he's going to punish generations that don't worship him. And then in verse 6, he says, but showing loving kindness to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. And Jesus is God, who says in John 14:15, if you love me, remember he's a jealous God, but he says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments.
Right.
Same God.
It's a long process of understanding that those commandments, everything he does for us, everything that he asks us to do, comes from a place of steadfast love. So idolatry is split between, do I trust God to mean that, right, to want the best for me and have the best for me, or am I going to trust something else? Anyway, thank you for your thoughts, comments tonight, in your ears.